Welcome everybody to our webinar. We're excited to have Professor Hassan Karar coming to us from Pakistan, from the Lahore University of Management Sciences. As many of you will know, probably Pakistan's top school in the social sciences. And as anyone who's followed Dr. Karar's work over the years know that he fits in perfectly with this exciting research that's coming out of LUMS. Dr. Karar is an associate professor with tenure at LUMS. He did his degrees in Canada at McGill, all three, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Bachelor, master's, and PhD. PhD in East Asian Studies from McGill. He was once upon a time in a land far, far away. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs, actually then the Munk Center, I believe. Again, far, far away.
That's right.
We're absolutely delighted to have him here. This talk is a part of the Belt and Road and Global Perspective series. It's a project that's run out of the Center for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies and the Asian Institute at the Munk School. It is funded by, I have to mention the funders, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and great thanks to SSHRC, thanks to CERES, thanks to the Asian Institute for support of this. We're truly excited to take stock in the course of this project of what we're calling the downstream effects of China's Belt and Road initiative. And Dr. Karar is both an expert on Central Asia, but also, coming from Pakistan, working in Pakistan, originally from Pakistan, is in a good position to tell us a little bit about how some of these processes are playing themselves out in this very specific context. The project that we mounted here at the Munk School tries to take account of the great variety that is the impact of China's engagement across space. But the notion that it may vary quite a bit from South Asia to Southeast Asia to Central Asia. And so we're trying to be attuned to what that variety really amounts to at the same time as we start to think about what patterns emerge. Hassan, it's great to have you here. I remember when you were here in, physically in Toronto the first time, or at least the first time I met you. I think you were finishing up your book that became this terrific look at Chinese foreign policy with regard to former Soviet Central Asia that came out with UBC Press. Since then, you've been working on Central Asia in a more micro scale, looking at some of the interactions that occur in the borderlands and sort of commercial spaces. And simultaneously developing your interest in similar kinds of topics, I think, in the borderlands that Pakistan has with China and with other neighbors. We're really excited to hear what you have to say. Really excited for a conversation. I think you'll go for maybe 45 minutes, and we'll save some time for Q&A with the audience. I will say that if you have a question, there should be a button at the bottom of the screen. You can put your question there at any time. We won't look at them until closer to the end of Dr. Karar's formal remarks. Thanks for joining us today. If we have any bandwidth issues, which apparently can occur, we'll roll with the punches. But look, if I start waving or doing something, then that's probably a sign that things aren't quite as audible or visible as they need to be. But in any case, welcome and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that warm introduction. It's a huge pleasure for me to be here. To the audience, good afternoon, good evening, and greetings from Lahore. So I want to begin by thanking the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies and the Asian Institute, the Munk School, for organizing this event. I'll just pull up some slides in a short while, but I've titled this talk Belt and Road on the Ground, Observations from an Early Adapter State. And my use of the term on the ground refers to methodology by which I'm foregrounding place and time-specific empirical evidence. I'm also using on the ground in a very literal sense. I'm inquiring what is actually happening in specific locales in Belt and Road host states. The early adopter state in the title refers to Pakistan, which has welcomed Chinese investment both under the BRI framework and through parallel financing mechanisms. For this reason, I think Pakistan is one of the ideal places to study the impact of BRI. And at this point, I'll just pull up my screen and begin with the slide sharing. So I'm hoping I'm audible and the screen is visible. I won't be getting into the specifics of Pakistan's history or politics in this talk. Rather, my intention is that may have parallels in other regions or other countries. In other words, what I'm interested in inquiring is, what might the experience of Pakistan tell us about BRI in general? That being said, much of what I described centers around questions of access and ownership, rent and control, which speaks to a pivotal point. It cannot but be deeply embedded within complex political economies. Local political economy contours BRI, and it's not always possible to say when something is a result of BRI or political and economic configurations in a particular area. Here, I should also point out that BRI is a discursive frame, which is how I'm going to treat it in this talk. In other words, sometimes we find that there are BRI projects which are taking place alongside non-BRI projects. There might even be projects which initially weren't BRI projects, but which over time have become BRI projects. So really, it's a fairly discursive category that we're dealing with over here. In Pakistan, BRI functions as an investment regime that's largely, although not exclusively, geared towards upgrading Pakistan's physical infrastructure capacity. Many of the projects that are being financed under the BRI framework have in fact been long planned. And that's one of the interesting things about BRI in Pakistan, the fact that you now have financing from China, which is being channeled toward projects which had already been talked about, but there previously hadn't been funding for these particular projects. There's two important aspects of BRI in Pakistan, which I will not be talking about, and I think it's important that I mention these from the very outset. The first is that I won't be talking about BRI as a game changer. Now, game changer is a phrase that's used quite frequently in Pakistan to describe BRI. And it speaks to the fact that BRI has been successful over the last 10 years or thereabouts in addressing some of the infrastructure deficiencies in the country. So yes, under BRI, the road network has expanded, and certainly under BRI, what we find is that energy generation has increased fairly substantially as well. But that's not something that I'm going to be focusing on in this talk. I'm also not going to be talking about BRI as a debt trap. At the moment, China holds about 20 to 30% of Pakistan's external debt. And while that is significant, I think it's a bit of a simplification to say that BRI is creating a debt trap for countries which sign on to it. I think that indebtedness, the possibility of default, comes about as a number of long-standing structural weaknesses, shortcomings in the economy. BRI may add to it, but I don't think that's the compounding factor. So these are very important lines of inquiry, but they're not ones that I'll be getting into in this particular talk. Before we sort of get into the talk itself, I do want to underscore the fact that Pakistan and China do enjoy particularly close ties. And I make this statement based upon a couple of observations. One is that it is extremely rare that officials on either side will criticize the other. Both China and Pakistan support each other in the face of international pressure. And the takeaway from this is not only that China has been a good friend to Pakistan, but that Pakistan has been a good friend to China as well. And China needs support from states such as Pakistan, by which I mean countries which are in step with China on all issues. And what you're seeing on the screen right now is a recent editorial that was published by the Chinese ambassador to Pakistan, Nongrong. And as you can see from some quotations that I've pulled out of this editorial, the ambassador is talking about the Pakistani Prime Minister's recent visit to Beijing, sort of pointing out the fact that Prime Minister Shahbaz was the first head of government to visit China after the 20th CPEC National Congress, where he was received with premium courtesy. A little bit later, Ambassador Nongrong goes on to talk about how President Xi met Prime Minister Shahbaz twice in the last 2 months. He describes the friendship between the two countries as an ironclad friendship. And then at the very end of the page, you can see this important statement, which speaks to the last point that I was making about the two countries supporting each other on international issues. There is a statement made by the ambassador where he says that this year Pakistan gave firm support to China in response to Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and its attempts to stir up Xinjiang-related issues at the Human Rights Council. Now, what I'm going to do in the remainder of this talk is focus my remarks on 5 observations about BRI in Pakistan. The first of these observations is that China is imagined in Pakistan in a multitude of ways. My second observation is that cartography is almost always aspirational, and here I'm talking specifically about BRI cartography and the way in which that's scaled down in Pakistan in the form of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. My third observation is that capital follows and spurs existing networks. My fourth observation is that most people don't care very much about BRI, and for valid reasons, I think. And then finally, my fifth observation is that development and new infrastructure can rupture community. So first, China is imagined in a multitude of ways. The images that you're seeing on the screen are from the 1960s. The one on the left is from Premier Zhou Enlai's visit to Rawalpindi in 1965. The individual on the right is President Ayub Khan of Pakistan. And the image on the right one, it's one that I found in the Dawn newspaper archives, and it's one that I think is really quite evocative and powerful. This is when the first trade caravan crossed over from Xinjiang into North Pakistan over the Karakoram Mountains. And this happened in 1969. The caravan came on camels and horses, and it was marking the resumption of trade after the Xinjiang North Hunza border had been shut in 1950 following the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Now, when we look at the language in which relations between the two countries are being described, it's quite striking in the extreme fraternity that is being expressed over here. So the two countries often describe themselves as iron brothers. Another oft-used phrase is that their friendship is higher than the Himalayas, deeper than the sea, stronger than steel, sweeter than honey, dearer than eyesight. So really, I mean, there's some very powerful evocative language that's being used over here. And I think the question that needs to be asked is, what exactly is going on? How do we make sense of this? And my own sense is that here we might be looking at the continuation of the Bandung lexicon of cooperation between South-South states, third world states, developing countries, which leads to the follow-up question that why does the Bandung lexicon continue to have traction as far as this bilateral relationship is concerned? And I think the reason for that is that the two countries were able to demarcate their Himalayan border early, and they were able to demarcate it without dispute. Related to that is the fact that both China and Pakistan have a long-standing and bitter territorial dispute with India. And then finally, there is an important point here as well, and that is that since at least the 1960s, Pakistan has seen China as a bulwark against the United States. Beyond Bandung, Pakistan sees China as a financier. Pakistan sees China as a willing counterbalance to normative Western global orders. Pakistan sees China as being successful in lifting people out of poverty. Pakistan greatly admires China's attempts at stamping out corruption. Now, for those of us who've studied China carefully, the last few of these points will certainly come across as being oversimplified. And they're not just oversimplified, but I'll go so far as saying that they're deliberately simplified narratives that eschew complexity. Their purpose is not to build deeper understanding about what's happening in China, but to project a particular image of China. My next observation with regards to BRI in Pakistan is that cartography is almost always aspirational. I find the image that you can see on the screen right now quite interesting and quite revealing. This is what happens when one puts the Belt and Road Initiative into a Google Images search box. And I think this is interesting because nearly 10 years into BRI, the depiction of BRI remains a map, and it's a fairly generic map, as you can see on the screen right now. Infrastructure is supposedly at the core of BRI, but there is no landmark infrastructure or infrastructure project by which you could depict BRI in a singular image. So we go back to the map. Now, these maps are broadly similar. One of the things that is common to a lot of these maps, in fact, almost all of these maps, is that there is a disregard for national borders, there's a disregard for terrain, local political economies, or in fact, what is actually happening on the ground. In each of these maps, the pivot seems to be around the Indian Ocean, which is to say that China is the other end where the roads, the Silk Roads, the modern day Silk Roads, if one wants to call them that, those are being anchored. So China is either the beginning or the end of the road. And I see these as examples of aspirational cartography. And let me pull the next one up. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor represents one of the bold strokes on the map that we saw on the previous slide. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is one of the 6 so-called economic corridors under BRI. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor was actually announced prior to Xi Jinping's now landmark speech that he made in Astana in September 2013. Initially, about $40 billion were pledged under the framework of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and that figure was subsequently revised to excess of $60 billion. Now, under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, investment can come from the Chinese government, it can come from SOEs, or it can come from private Chinese enterprises. More often than not, with the exception of the Gwadar port, the investment that's coming in is coming in on commercial rates of approximately 4% interest, which is an important point. And that's something that's very often overlooked here in the country. There's an assumption, at least as far as popular imagination is concerned, that this is aid. It's not aid. This is a financing mechanism that's working on commercial rates. In Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is often described as a flagship project of the Belt and Road, although in Pakistan as well, one often sees cartographic descriptions of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor similar to what we saw on the previous slide and what you can see on the map on the left. And I think the important point to keep in mind is that what we're looking over here is projections. So much of this has actually not been constructed. Once again, 10 years into the project. So here too, we're looking at aspirational cartography. And the image on the right is once again an example of aspirational cartography, aspirational city planning. This was a plan for city development that appeared in 2021, in which supposedly long stretches of the coast outside of Karachi would be developed. And as you can see, sort of a fantastical city would arise out of the sea. So once again, we're looking at aspirations. And needless to add, in both cases, this hasn't actually occurred. This hasn't actually happened. There's another issue over here when one looks at financialization and BRI in Pakistan, and that is that there are competing priorities, which then end up resulting in fairly significant entanglements. These entanglements speak to the fact that there's a multitude of interest groups in the country, and they're probably wanting to channel investments in particular areas. And broadly speaking, infrastructure investment can be collapsed into three categories. First of all, there is strategic infrastructure, and the best example of strategic infrastructure is the Gwadar port. And if you look at the map on the left, then the Gwadar port you can see in the lower left-hand corner. So it's in Balochistan province, it's close to the border with Iran. This was a nondescript fishing village, as I'll talk about in a few minutes. And since 2013, the Gwadar port has been leased to the Chinese, and it's being developed, and that's seen as a strategic priority for the country. So that's an example of strategic infrastructure. Then there's national infrastructure. The national infrastructure would include a railway line, the upgrading of the railway line that's running through the country. It could include fiber optic cables. It could include power generation plants. But the question that arises regarding national infrastructure is of financial feasibility. You can build this infrastructure, but will it pay for itself? And then finally, there's provincial or local infrastructure. Local infrastructure would include things like intracity mass transit, plans for coastal habilitation, similar to what you're seeing on the screen on the right-hand side. It could include the planned special economic zones. And the question over here is, can provincial politicians, can local politicians attract investment? Okay, my third observation regarding BRI in Pakistan is that capital follows and spurs existing networks. Okay, let me first talk about land development and property speculation that follows these capital networks. Now, earlier I had been talking about Gwadar, and what you're seeing on the screen right now is a screenshot from sort of a property developer that says that, describing how Gwadar is emerging as the latest sort of hot property market, if you may. Once again, that game-changing phrase appears frequently in the public when one is talking about the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And if you can read the text below it, it says that Gwadar's real estate saw a significant boom following the signing of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So, clearly there's been sort of an increase in interest as far as property development in Gwadar is concerned. Now, if we take a step back and consider the fact that at the turn of the century, Gwadar was a nondescript fishing village, then of course the interest in property in Gwadar is quite novel and quite a transformation from what had been there until very, very recently. Once again, if one went back to the turn of the century, before there was an interest in developing Gwadar as a real estate market, what we would have found is that property would have been communal. The land and the sea were actually commons. And what happened soon afterwards, so early in the new century, was that advertisements for housing colonies, as they were known in the country, began appearing in Pakistani newspapers. And what seemed at that time as if land was being acquired for these residential colonies. Again, that phrase is a little problematic, I understand. And at the time, these were either outright scams, or at best, they were highly speculative investments for would-be investors. And clearly, the property developers were working closely with state authorities. And this is what I like to think of as very murky margins where public and private interests begin to fuse. Then in 2013, the Gwadar port was acquired by the Chinese Overseas Port Holding Company. At this point, yet more land was acquired by property developers. And with time, acquiring land, investing in land in Gwadar went from being a sketchy investment to a far more secure one. Today, there are about 43 housing colonies in Gwadar, which have names like Creek City, New World City, Green City, Medina City, Gwadar City, Ocean Marina. I found a Canadian city as well, a China village, Gwadar Golf City, Marine Homes, so on and so forth. And the lesson over here, I think, is that when BRI capital was focused in a particular area, which in this case is Gwadar, it reinvigorated these local networks. And while Gwadar has seen little marine traffic to date, land development and property speculation has triggered a financial boom in the area. Now, the next example that I want to use about how networks draw and manage BRI capital is how Chinese financing and Chinese SOEs, Chinese private enterprises will frequently work alongside two companies in particular. And the two companies in particular are the Frontier Works Organization and the National Logistics Cell. And both of these are commercial paramilitary arms of the Pakistani military. And they also happen to be the largest logistics and construction firms in the country. And if you look at the slide, this is a quote from the Director General of the Frontier Works Organization, who's being quoted in an article in the Shanghai Business Review. And there's a little bit of exaggeration over here, but Pakistan lies at a unique geostrategic location. For hundreds of centuries, the caravans of traders, warriors, and explorers passed through its legendary routes. The mythical Silk Road provided the only access to Kashgar and far-off lands of China. Well, once again, slight exaggeration. And then we must take an institutionalized approach at a national level. We must form a policy framework in coordination with all the stakeholders and the Chinese government to harmonize all the various aspects of the corridor. Okay, the image on the left, if you look closely, you can see a bulldozer clearing a landslide. This is how we might imagine the Frontier Works Organization to traditionally work. It's a large construction company, paramilitary, it's an arm of the military. They're engaged in road maintenance, road construction. The image on the right, which was taken on the Karakoram Highway in November 2021, sort of a new road was being built, traffic had been blocked, and we were waiting for the go-ahead to continue our journey. I got out of the car and I was taking photographs, and what you can see right in the foreground are two maroon-colored pickup trucks with Hakas written on the back. These are local level contractors, which then work with an organization like the Frontier Works Organization. So essentially what we're now seeing is that we have a Chinese SOE. In this case, it's the SOE that, along with the Frontier Works Organization, is engaged in dam construction. There's a river running on the right where a large dam is going to be built. So you have financing from the Chinese SOE, you have the local paramilitary working alongside smaller contractors, and then the smaller contractors would be working with local labor. So what we end up seeing is a cascading effect of capital. So it's not simply a question of Chinese finance landing in a certain area, China bringing its own labor. That's not the case. It's in fact a pyramid of sorts in which, as you get closer to the ground, it gets more and more spread out and more diffused. So what we're in fact looking at is Chinese capital being embedded in these already existing networks of financing and logistics provision, construction, so on and so forth. Okay, my fourth point today is that most people don't really care very much about BRI, and probably for valid reasons. So the images that you're seeing in front of you right now, these are from the Afiatabad Bazaar, which is 75 kilometers from the border with China. So once again, this is up in the Karakoram. If you look at the image on the left, there's a road on the far left of the image. And if one were to continue up that road for another 75 kilometers or thereabouts, one would reach the Pakistan-China border at a place called Khunjrab. So put differently, if one were coming overland from China into Pakistan, this would be the first of the border markets that one would be reaching. And over the last 10 years, I've been out to this border market about 6 different times. And I'm doing that because I want to understand how connectivity manifests on the ground. In 2016, which is when the image on the left was taken, a student assistant of mine and we surveyed the market, and we counted about 240 shops. But what was interesting was that out of those 240 shops, about 2/3 were either closed or they had, in fact, never been open. And we had visited in the summer, and the summer is when there is peak traffic through the area. So in other words, out of this marketplace, only about 1/3 of the shops were functioning, a total of 80 shops, and the large majority of them were shut, as you can see in the photograph. And when we spoke to the traders, they told us that since the China-Pakistan economic corridor came into effect, trade in the bazaar had actually declined. And that I felt was rather interesting. Now, since the 1980s, independent traders had been shuttling goods across the border from Kashgar, from Tashkargan. They'd bring small amounts of goods into North Pakistan, and they would sell it in border markets similar to what you're seeing on the screen right now. And once the China-Pakistan economic corridor was coming into effect, a new tariff regime was put in place. And as a consequence of this new tariff regime, it became harder and harder for people to be self-importing goods. And instead, what we ended up seeing is that while the volume of cargo was increasing, it was all heavy cargo. And that you can see on the image on the right-hand side. These are container trucks, which are coming in increasingly larger numbers. And if you look closely, there's another container truck behind it, and there's another container truck behind that one as well. And they're all coming down from the dry port. So in other words, what happens now is that you have container trucks coming in, but they go to the dry port, the goods are unloaded at the dry port, and those goods then make their way to distant locales down country. So in other words, the earlier border trade has been replaced by large-scale trade. And the consequence of that is that local livelihoods have suffered as a consequence of that. And here I think that there's some utility in thinking about past connectivities, past iterations of cross-border ties, where we see that connectivity benefited the local people, it benefited community. But that's probably not the case anymore. And increasingly, the goods that are coming in are heading to increasingly distant locales. So in fact, what we might be looking at is a form of infrastructure bypass. Okay. My next example is from the Indus Delta region in southern Pakistan. The Indus Delta region in Pakistan it's a parched land, it's a desolate land. It's where the Indus River is supposed to reach the Indian Ocean. Most years, there is no water in the lower stretches of the Indus Delta. This is a result of a century of upriver dam building, siphoning off of water. But the consequence is that downcountry, there's desertification, there's salination, there's loss of arable land. And what you're seeing on the screen is what the majority of the people who remain in the Delta do. They go out to sea on these small fishing vessels, and they try to eke out a living in an unregulated, informal fishing industry. Now, what's interesting over here is that since 1995, there have been at least 3 plans to build a magnificent port city in this area. And it is said that this port city would rival Dubai, or it would rival Shenzhen. More recently, what we've seen is that local politicians have tried to take these existing plans and tack them on to the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So this is an example of how provincial politicians or local politicians will try and attract investment into their particular constituencies. So once the China-Pakistan economic corridor became sort of a popular frame for development and investment in the country, there was talk about bringing some of that money into city development in the Indus Delta region. Now, what's interesting over here is that the people that I have spoken with treat these plans either with a great deal of ambivalence or with a very high degree of suspicion. And they describe it as being akin to a land grab, which would dislocate the remaining people off of the land. And speaking further to them, it becomes quite clear that such mega development isn't really meaningful. Development is only meaningful if it can provide public goods such as water, if it can provide roads, schools, health facilities, if it can secure access to the commons, if it can reverse environmental degradation. And there's a very real community level consensus on what constitutes well-being, and it's certainly not large-scale infrastructure development. And as I'll demonstrate, these very questions are being asked at this very moment in Gwadar in Balochistan. Which brings me to my 5th observation, that development and infrastructure can rupture community. Now, the images that you're seeing on the screen right now, these are from Gwadar about this time last year, perhaps a little bit later, December 2021. And in December 2021, rights movement began in Gwadar. Gwadar, once again, is that port, sort of far western part of Balochistan, which had been acquired by the China Port Holding Company in 2013. And as you can see from these images, the rights movement had attracted wide-scale participation from the local populace, including the women and children. And some of the signs on the placards that are being held up by the children say things like, we want teachers, we don't want the military, we want an end to trawler fishing. And those were the exact demands of the demonstrators. They wanted an end to trawler fishing. They wanted to have access to the sea, which have been lost by the local fisher folks. They wanted a resumption of border trade. And very, very importantly, and this is something that I'll speak about sort of in the next and final example that I'll bring up. And very importantly, they wanted the abolishment of checkposts. So one of the things that has happened since the China-Pakistan economic corridor, since the port was acquired by China, is that the number of checkposts in the area have increased very, very significantly, so much so that moving between any 2 points means that one has to stop at multiple points, identify themselves, and then proceed. And the leadership of the rights movement, and once again, demonstrations are still underway. Their demands were agreed upon last year, but they were not actually fulfilled. Once again, there's people demonstrating at this very moment. They've set the 20th of November as a deadline. And what the leadership of this rights movement is saying is that we don't want this China-Pakistan economic corridor. And the conclusion from that, I think, is actually quite sobering. And the conclusion from that is that development under BRI is leading to a deprivation of rights. And further, from that, one can posit that there's at least some people out there who now see themselves as being worse off than they had been previously. Okay, this is my final example. So here I want to talk about securitization in the Karakoram. These are images from along dam construction sites. The image on the top and the image on the left are from dam construction sites along the Indus. The image on the lower right is from a dam construction site in a parallel valley. And what's been happening in these areas is that the entire area, excuse me, has become heavily securitized. What we're seeing is that this entire area is guarded by the military. There's concrete walls, there's razor wires, there's a multitude of checkposts in this entire region, which has become, in fact, a ubiquitous feature of traveling along this stretch of the Karakorams. So, completely besides the question of environmental damage, the cost of construction, whether Pakistan can actually afford these dams, and I think more fundamentally than that, whether or not big dams ought to be built in the first place, we have infrastructure which is transforming community and, of course, transforming everyday mobilities as well. And elsewhere, I have argued that these construction sites have become spaces of exception outside of normative law, and the very fact that they are guarded by the military outside of normative policing as well. So you have the military, which is deployed to deal with supposedly extraordinary threats. You have securitized infrastructure, which serves as a backdrop to everyday mobilities. And you can probably make this out on your screens if you look very closely, but none of the trucks shown in these images have license plates. So a normative law, a very basic traffic regulation that every vehicle is supposed to have a unique identification number clearly doesn't apply in these spaces of exception either. So to conclude, these are broad observations about BRI in Pakistan. The first point that I made was that China is being imagined in a multitude of ways, and there's sort of a deliberate oversimplification as far as the imagination of China is concerned. Another observation of mine is that with regards to BRI in Pakistan, we're looking at cartography that is aspirational. This is true whether we're talking about BRI cartography or whether we're talking about cartographic depictions of the Belt and Road Initiative and the infrastructure that is supposed to be built through the China-Pakistan economic corridor. My third observation was that capital follows and spurs existing networks. So in other words, political economy and localized political economy is contouring the investments that are coming in from China. My fourth observation was that in many places where BRI touches down or where there are proposals to bring it in, most people don't care about BRI because what is happening or what they imagine is happening is something that would create new vulnerabilities within community. And then finally, the fifth point that I made at the end was that development and new infrastructure can end up rupturing community. Thank you very much, and I welcome any questions and comments that you might have. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Hassan. That was a terrifically rich, insightful, and clear presentation. Sometimes we get one of those three characteristics in our presentations. We rarely get them all, and the bandwidth was not at all an issue, at least from where I'm sitting in the Monk School.
Thank you so much.
Great. Well, so let me invite I'll ask you a question. I see a few questions have started to come in on the Q&A. You can go ahead and press that button at the bottom, and the question will go to us. I don't think that you will see it afterwards, but trust the process, trust the technology. The question will make its way to us, and we'll ask as many questions as we can. But let me go ahead and get you started, Hassan, because I want to ask maybe for clarification on the relationship between your fourth and your fifth points, right? Because I'm sure there are ways to square the circle, but the fourth point I think is most people don't care about the BRI, and with good reason. And then the fifth one is about the potential, at least, for disrupting community, right? That some of these infrastructure and other forms and other interventions can, well, they certainly can change things, right? I mean, they're designed to be game changers, even if they don't succeed, right? So, and some of those changes may be welcomed by some parties, maybe not particularly welcome by others. So, and when you were talking about, okay, now I can't remember, I'm looking at my notes. Well, actually, a couple of your cases, you said people, oh, right, this was the border crossing 70 kilometers from the, so the large scale now trans-border commerce is displacing smaller scale. And I assume, I mean, you say people have suffered as a consequence. I assume you mean sort of smaller scale traders. Presumably they care about the BRI, or maybe they don't call it the BRI. In other words, how do people think about this? Is the BRI a kind of a coherent enough and visible enough slogan that ordinary people who are negatively affected can say, aha, the reason that I'm suffering is because of that thing? Or is it somehow much more general? In other words, sort of like, who do they blame for their predicaments, and how does that, how do numbers 4 and 5?
Sure, well, that's an excellent question. So in the border market that you're talking about, when one goes over there and one talks about the China-Pakistan economic corridor, they point to the road. So we're standing on the road, we're standing on the Karakoram highway, and they're saying, this is the corridor. And then they'll sort of, would you call this a corridor? Does this look like a corridor to you? So there's a very literal spatialization that is taking place. So they don't see it as an investment mechanism. The narrative has been that BRI, or in Pakistan, we would call it CPEC. So the China-Pakistan, they pronounce the acronym. So, they'll say CPEC, and they'll say that, well, this was supposed to benefit us, but it's not benefiting us. Here's a concrete example. So the people who are domiciled in the mountain areas close to the border with Xinjiang, they could previously cross into Xinjiang with a border trading permit. And the number of people who are applying for these border trading permits, even pre-COVID, had been declining very sharply. And what one could previously do is travel to Tashqargan, travel to Kashgar, buy a certain amount of goods. And if it was up till 300 kilograms, or if you could convince the border officials that it was under 300 kilograms, then you could bring it in and not pay any tariffs. But that's gone now. And they have to pay for pretty much everything that they're bringing in. So it's not viable anymore. And someone I know who used to go to Kashgar and Tashqargan, he now runs a marriage hall in Rawalpindi. So they've looked for other avenues of work. But it's sort of, I think, for me, the striking thing is that it was meant to, well, not meant to, I mean, it wasn't meant to do that, but one would imagine that with the China-Pakistan economic corridor, these cross-border flows between people would increase, but they've actually decreased. But the volume of goods coming in is certainly increasing. And it's all destined to much, much more distant locales. And people are cognizant of what's going on. I mean, they see this very clearly. They might not have the language and the vocabulary to describe it, but they see the decline in border trade. They see how again, property in that market, which used to be virtually free, is now skyrocketing beyond anyone who lives there affordability, and it's all being bought up by investors from outside.
No, that's super helpful. At some point I have a follow-up. I have all sorts of questions, but rather than abuse my prerogative, I will go to some questions that are in the chat. Let me start with one that's on on CPEC, right? This is from. Actually, I was instructed not to mention names. I will mention one name later because he's our PhD student and identifies himself as such. But there's a question here. Dear Mr. Carr, thank you for the informative presentation. Despite the problems you mentioned, CPEC seems to be contributing to the trade connectivity in a positive way. And then a more open version of the question, how has CPEC been affecting the local industries in Pakistan? Does CPEC lead to deindustrialization?
That's a good question. I think that no doubt in certain aspects, the China-Pakistan economic corridor has been beneficial. It has alleviated infrastructure bottlenecks, once again, as far as power is concerned, as far as motorways are concerned. But I'm not convinced that it has actually sort of assisted as far as industrialization in the country is concerned. I don't think that there's evidence that trade has increased directly as a result of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. It may have been increasing for other reasons. It may be that there is increased access to Pakistani markets as a consequence of sort of the fact that goods from China usually come in at a lower price point. But I don't necessarily see that as being something that is being addressed or affected by BRI itself. And once again, I mean, I see the corridor and the China-Pakistan economic corridor as primarily a financing mechanism. And not one that is addressing issues of trade. Now, potentially down the road, if the special economic zones actually do get built, which doesn't appear to be happening anytime soon, then of course there is a possibility that new industry could be set up. But I think trade cooperation, industrial cooperation is a somewhat different process.
There's another question here, which, I mean, since we're on the CPEC, can you talk a little bit about the global geopolitical context in which this is being built? Maybe not very quickly, maybe you know, in a bit of an aspirational sense, but nonetheless, things are happening. Can you talk about the geopolitical context and maybe the geopolitical significance, if there is one, right? I mean, one possibility is that it's really not about that, but what are your thoughts on that dimension?
I think it marks close ties between the two countries. I think it's extremely important for Pakistan, and I think it's also extremely important for China that the China-Pakistan economic corridor come across as being a success. I think there's a very tightly woven narrative around the China-Pakistan economic corridor, as is evidenced in the way in which it is being reported on in the national media. Anecdotally, this is something that journalists will talk about, that reporting follows a certain pattern, namely that this is something that is beneficial. The type of comments that I made about the China-Pakistan economic corridor is not reflective of the popular viewpoint. That being said, I think that there is a strain of thought within Pakistan that somehow the United States is threatened by Pakistan's relationship with China. I think that's perhaps giving a little too much self-importance to Pakistan. I honestly don't think that the rest of the world cares very much in terms of whether the China-Pakistan economic corridor is a success or not. So yeah, I mean, I think that it is important as far as being a so-called flagship of BRI is concerned. But I think the other question over here is, and I say this somewhat hesitantly, but there is going to come a time when we're going to stop talking about BRI and when BRI is going to become a thing of the past. And sort of there's hints that perhaps even in China, we're now seeing the beginnings of perhaps a post-BRI world as well. So yeah, I mean, we've made a big deal out of it. And for good reason. I think this has been one of the big developments as far as international global initiatives are concerned. But in terms of its geopolitical significance, I don't know. I mean, I could be wrong on this. I'm just thinking as I speak.
I mean, it jives with things you read elsewhere about how, as a slogan or as a broad sort of umbrella for a variety of a cluster of related projects with real money and backing behind it, but nonetheless, as a slogan, it may have run its course, or it may have started to have an ambiguous connotation. And so, at a minimum, why not rebrand it? Declare the start of a new campaign, something that, the question is how far to distance yourself from BRI, and when this would happen. But with you, I think we easily could be wrong. The BRI as a way, as a discursive formation might continue, right? It may be that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, but we'll see how that develops. I do want to let me lump together two questions I think are potentially related, and it gets to you started to talk about how some of these things are talked about in the press, right? Presumably, this is mostly TV, but also the print or internet media, and that you hinted that maybe your slightly more critical take is not really what you normally would read in the press. Is that right? Okay, so this gets to questions about sort of what is being publicized about these arrangements. One person asks, are loans and agreements, are China-Pakistan loans and agreements made public now? And especially and then there's this related question there, interests in Afghanistan's minerals, does BRI via Pakistan plan to reach Afghanistan, right? So there's lots of sensitive issues, potentially sensitive issues embedded therein. And let me lump this with one other one, which I think is related, though you can tell me if I'm wrong. This comes from Thomas Bruce, who's our PhD student in the Department of Political Science here. They all, by the way, they all say wonderful presentation. I'm kind of skipping over that because we all agree it's a wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thomas says that. He says, given your point about capital following and spurring existing networks, is Chinese investment strengthening the structural position of the military and state-linked firms within Pakistan's economy? Perhaps more specifically, the economic interests of the military itself, following Aisha Siddiqa's concept of mil-biz, I guess military business.
Military business, yeah.
Military business. So, and of course, this can be related to the degree of transparency or lack of transparency question.
Yeah. Good questions. Okay, well, first the one about how much information we actually have vis-a-vis what's being negotiated. I think there is actually a fair amount of information. I think for a very long time, we had been saying that we don't know enough about the contracts, we don't know enough about the agreements. It might very well be that we don't know everything, but we still have access to a lot more information that we're actually using. So I showed images of the Hakka trucks. And if one scours the internet, one discovers that the Pakistani government has actually made a lot of information available in terms of subcontracting that's going on, in terms of who is bidding for which project, in terms of what came up when a certain project was being audited. So I think the issue isn't, in the case of Pakistan at least, the issue isn't so much that we don't know enough about the finer details. I think the issue more broadly speaking is that we haven't really gone in and swooped up all the information that is publicly available, that the government is making available. And we haven't worked very, very extensively with it, or we haven't worked with it at all. I think that if you see what's being written about the China-Pakistan economic corridor, for the longest time, it was just all geopolitics, and it was all saying how this is going to change the fate of the country. So yeah, I mean, while more information is always good, I'm a little overwhelmed at the fact that there is still so much out there that we haven't really worked with, that we haven't really mined. So that would be my position on that. And yeah, I mean, and I'll speak about myself. I mean, I shouldn't speak about other people. One gets lazy. I mean, you sort of just work with the information that you have. You want to go back and sort of look at the same bits of information again, hoping for new insights. But there's a lot more where that came from, and I think that there is certainly much more scope for new insights. Afghanistan, yeah, I mean, that's a terrific question. And it's one that I don't really have a very good answer to. And it's one that was, I was queried on that quite a few times by people outside Pakistan, people getting in touch with me after August last year. And I haven't followed that story very closely, but my own sense, having looked closely at how the Chinese built ties with Central Asia, is that my own sense is that the Chinese will probably approach Afghanistan and Afghanistan's potential very, very gradually, very cautiously, which is what they did in Central Asia as well. So sort of following the Taliban takeover, there was all these new stories coming out about how China is going to go right in and swoop everything out of Afghanistan. I don't see it happening quite like that. I think that this is an area in which China will probably resort to its traditional diplomatic practices, biding its time, being mindful of the larger geopolitical environment. And really, it's in no rush. I mean, there's no one else that's going to go in and start negotiating and signing contracts with the Taliban. So they can afford to take their time, as they did in Central Asia. Sort of they approached the independence of Central Asia very, very cautiously, extremely deliberately. That was a hallmark of China's policy towards the region, and I would say it was an absolute success. The final bit, yeah, I mean, sort of, the state, the military business relations. Yeah, there's a whole other dimension of Pakistan-China relations, which is completely outside anything that I talked about, and that is military to military cooperation. That sort of stays firmly behind closed doors. I mean, we know very, very little in terms of the type of defense cooperation that takes place between the two countries. But my own understanding is that it is significant, it is large. My own sense is that a significant portion of Pakistan's defense capacity is coming from China. And then certainly, I think that what we're seeing with BRI is that the military does benefit, and it benefits through these paramilitary organizations such as the Frontier Works Organization, the National Logistics Cell. To give you an example, and this is something I didn't talk about in this talk, but it's something that I've written about earlier. There was a dry port that was set up in North Pakistan, and this dry port had been set up as a joint venture between between a North Hunza Trust and Sinotrans Xinjiang, which is a subsidiary of China's largest logistics provider. It's a long story, but this joint venture was mired in controversy from the very beginning, and it just stumbled along for about 10 years, and eventually it was taken over by the National Logistics Cell. So that's an example of how the National Logistics Cell benefits. The National Logistics Cell, the Frontier Works Organization, they can also bid for public contracts. So on the one hand, there are commercial paramilitary arm of the military. But if there's a tender that's being floated for a particular project, for particular expertise insofar as the movement of goods, the unloading of shipment, tolling, clearing, building a dry port is concerned, they can step in and put in a competitive bid. So yeah, I mean, there's money to be made, certainly. How much money is going to be made is a separate story. I think that there was a lot of excitement. And again, this goes back to the point that I was making early on as well, that there may come a time in the foreseeable future when we don't talk about BRI anymore. And I'm thinking back to, say, for example, 4 or 5 years pre-COVID. A single day wouldn't go by in which you wouldn't pick up the Daily, a newspaper in Pakistan, and you wouldn't see the China-Pakistan economic corridor being described as a game changer every single day. But now that's been spaced out. I mean, now, days go by and we don't read anything about the China-Pakistan economic corridor. Once again, sort of going back 3-4 years, great excitement. This is going to change the fate of the country. 4% of global trade is going to transit Pakistan. All sorts of fantastical projections. Well, those dates, those years have come and gone, and we're still here. We have better power supply. We have nicer motorways. But again, as a percentage of Pakistan's economy, that's just a very, very small contribution to the overall economy of this country.
Really, really interesting. I'm gonna abuse the privilege of the chair to ask a tiny little question on that, and then I'm going to lump together a question that Professor Rachel Silvey, who's co-running this project, the Belt and Road and Global Perspective, she asks in the chat. So let me just start with her question, echoing the thanks for a very interesting talk. Again, like I said, everybody has the same impression. She was especially interested in the observations about the Bandung lexicon and its history. Could you speak about the ways that you see that lexicon as relevant and or not relevant to the BRI in Pakistan in 2023, presumably also 2022, but who knows? I also will add another question, sort of comes from your most recent thought, where you're talking about the projections, right, or the expectations that were amplified through the news media about what CPEC would become, and so on and so forth. I guess I wonder, do you see any evidence that you talk about aspirational cartography and so on, right? And there's a lot that's aspirational here. It's not just the cartography; it's the planning in general. Perhaps it's the financing. Perhaps it's the. Do you see any evidence that the promises that are being made, either explicitly or visually or implicitly or so on, that they become a liability when they're not mostly met? I mean, yes, you can begin to walk back some of the promises, but at what point do these grand plans and grand aspirations become something that is, a bit of a burden for you, or a political problem?
That's yeah, no, I mean that's a good question, and I'm sort of I'm trying very hard not to answer that question as someone who has a slightly critical view of promises that are made by politicians and never fulfilled, which kind of answers what you had asked in the first place. So, I mean, in this country, promises are, they're a dime a dozen. I mean, it's promises are made very frequently, and I guess what I'm getting at, and sort of I'll try and be. So this is how I would put it. I don't. So when the state comes in, when state officials come in, when provincial politicians come in, when they say that, look, we're going to channel CPEC investments in a particular area, this is going to be transformative, I think there's a very high degree of skepticism. And that very high degree of skepticism is a result of the fact that there is a long history in this country of promises being made by made by rulers, made by state officials, made by politicians, which are not being fulfilled. And again, I'm trying to not use the word cynical, avoided using it until this point in time, but there is a certain cynicism. And the cynicism basically revolves around the fact that promises are made when you want something from the constituents, and then of course when you get it, then you don't give them back anything in return. So no, the short answer is that I'm not aware of any backlash of promises unfulfilled. And on the contrary, what we've seen is that, and I've touched upon this, and I think this is something that one could have spoken more about, but in certain areas where there have been plans for building special economic zones, there's actually been resistance to that, because to build a special economic zone, you would need to acquire land. And that land belongs to someone else. I mean, if it doesn't belong to an individual, then it is communally owned. And they don't want to lose that land. And if land is not being lost, then certainly what is happening is that along areas where investment is imagined to be channeled, property prices are just going through the roof. And it's being bought up by investors from down country, from the big cities. So yeah, I mean, when these plans don't materialize, I think it's something that people would expect. The Bandung lexicon, yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, and I think language is important. I think that the way in which you frame fraternity is important. I think it's meaningful. I think that the words that people choose to use is important as well. And this is, if you may, something of a new realization, and it's not something that I had thought very much about until quite by accident I started studying the Chinese investment regime in Pakistan, where the same phrases were coming up again and again. Friendship of a certain type, sort of iron being used to describe that friendship. And yeah, I mean, I think it signals a fraternity, it signals a shared positionality as far as global politics is concerned, and it has a history, and it has a history which I think is unbroken, at least going back until the 1960s. And I think it's also important because it signals towards what may come. And given the fact that this lexicon, the Bandung lexicon, continues to live on as far as China-Pakistan bilateral relations are concerned, there is every evidence that it will continue into the future as well. And once again, the thing that I want to underscore over here is the fact that one can see it as just words, one can see it as both sides depicting extreme affinity for each other, extreme proximity of position. But behind that are the two states working closely together. Now, mind you, that doesn't necessarily have to be on economic issues. It can be on political issues, it can be on issues pertaining to international pressures, which one state will help the other deflect. And that's kind of the interesting thing vis-a-vis China's relations with small states. And this is something that I first started thinking about when I was more actively looking at China's relations with the Central Asian republics. Why does China need Tajikistan? Why does China need Kyrgyzstan? Why is it that when the Chinese leadership sits down with the Central Asian leadership, when they sit down with the heads of state of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, why is it that the Chinese head of state is treating them as equals? Or why is it that they are sitting down as equals? And I think that the reason for that is that these so-called small states, or states which are economically small, still have an extremely, extremely important role to play insofar as providing support to China is concerned on matters of human rights, on matters of Chinese governance in internal peripheries like Xinjiang and Hong Kong. So they do provide very important leverage. And I think the Bandung lexicon is something that frames that relationship especially for China and Pakistan.
Really, really interesting. I mean, that may actually get to the topic that you made very clear at the beginning was not your topic, right? Talked about the debt trap and so on. But I guess the question is, there's a question in here that's about the sustainability, which is the same way of getting at this debt. Like, is it essentially going to become profitable, the infrastructure, by some understanding? What kind of heroic imagination would it take to think about profitability, and what are the time horizons for this? And I guess related, does it really matter? Which is another way of saying, is defaulting on a debt really that catastrophic? Will China essentially renegotiate the terms, given what's at stake with having good relations with your neighbor?
Absolutely. And that's what's happened recently. So the Pakistani Prime Minister, and this refers to the editorial that Ambassador Nongrong wrote in the Express Tribune exactly 1 week ago. The Pakistani Prime Minister was there. They were successful in getting the repayments rolled back. I think there was about, I could be wrong on this because I hadn't prepared this, but there was about 10 billion that was due imminently, and they managed to get that rolled back. Now, the flip side, of course, is that, the country is just accumulating this debt. And yes, it's true that the single largest holder of debt for Pakistan is China. So Pakistan owes more to China than it does to any other country. But again, that's 20 to 30%, and Pakistan owes a lot more money to other states. And again, if Pakistan is going to default, if that's going to happen, and I don't think that's imminent, but if that were to happen, it's not going to be because of BRI. It's going to be because of close to a dozen IMF programs that the country signed on to since the 1980s, never fulfilled any of them. The fact that the tax net in this country is minuscule. There's maybe 2-3 million people out of 220 plus who actually pay taxes. The spectrum of fiscal mismanagement is actually, it's a very, very broad one. And sure, Pakistan is, my opinion is that Pakistan is taking loans under BRI frameworks that will be hard pressed to pay back in a foreseeable amount of time. But there's a host of other economic structural issues which are creating a mini economic crisis in this country.
Yeah, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but the way I think about this is to be indebted over a finite and definite period of time may have advantages over being indefinitely indebted, right?
Sure. Absolutely.
Indebted without any timeline may not necessarily be better.
And again, it's interesting that we're having this conversation, and I'm actually thinking to the bazaar traders that I speak with in Central Asia. What these guys say is that, so long as you can keep on carrying forward the debt, that's okay. You're an operation, sure, you have debts, but the inventory is there, there's turnover, it's all good.
You should run the U.S. Treasury. This sounds about right. Okay, let me lump together two questions, just because we're kind of starting to get to the end of our time. These are two questions, I guess, somewhat related. They're really about the sort of human side of these of the BRI and related sorts of developments. One person asks about education and scientific research networks, right? Saying that there are now tens of thousands of Pakistani students studying in China, many PhD programs that support expertise needed in different BRI-related projects, others in medical schools. China is also working on developing a range of scientific research centers in different regions of Pakistan to address local needs. As China becomes an increasingly important source of higher education for Pakistan, how might that further develop other networks between these two countries? So that's one question about the sort of, at least by the this is not my area, but I'm taking this at face value, that the increasingly dense educational and scientific networks between the two countries. And then the second one, it actually goes back to your fifth point on human development, rupturing community, or can rupture community. And the person asks, how can we reconcile the human rights issues or the rights issues mentioned that can happen in development with that can happen in development and meaningful infrastructure, especially among local communities that perhaps have been living in these areas of development for years. This parallels research that this person is doing on gentrification. Surely the answer is not to avoid or reject local or national infrastructures. So can you elaborate on how development under the BRI can lead to issues of human rights at all? So reconciling those two maybe distinctive but linked kinds of issues.
Yes, well, thank you for that. The very good questions. Okay, so yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's I believe upwards of 20,000 students, Pakistani students, who are studying in universities in China. I could be mistaken on this, but I think China takes more students from Pakistan than almost any other country. Most of these are students who are going into the sciences or going into engineering. Now, there's two things that I want to say on this. One is easy, the other is going to be slightly tricky. The easy one is that there's very, very few students going into the humanities and social sciences. So the Pakistani students who do go from here to study in China will train in engineering, they'll train in medicine. And I wish that there was more people going into humanities and social sciences, perhaps, you know, studying Chinese history, studying Chinese philosophy, it's you know, learning about Chinese culture. So, you know, there's a very real dearth of expertise on China in this country. I think you would be really hard pressed to find a trained sinologist. You know, one wishes that there was, you know, say a cohort of Pakistani students reading the Oracle Bones or learning to read classical Chinese, or but there isn't. So yes, I mean, there are a very large number of Pakistani students, but they're all in very specific disciplines. The other issue is, and you know, this is the one that I need to articulate carefully. The other issue is that, and again, I need to articulate this carefully because, you know, one could very well ask what empirical evidence I'm bringing to this. Well, my empirical evidence is the fact that I'm a university teacher and I teach undergraduate students who have aspirations for graduate school abroad. And when the students I teach talk about graduate school abroad, or when they think about graduate school abroad, they're all thinking about either going to North America or going to Europe. So United States, Canada, sort of Great Britain, those are sort of higher on the pecking order. Western Europe, a little bit lower on the pecking order. Central and Eastern Europe, sort of yet lower. By default, people are not thinking about going to China to study. Just as in the 1980s, when one thought about leaving Pakistan for higher education, one thought about going to North America, going to Europe, people didn't think about going to the Soviet Union. People did go to the Soviet Union. Once again, people were going to study medicine in the Soviet Union, people went to study engineering in the Soviet Union, but that was your fourth or your fifth choice. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how to say that in such a way that it's not making it appear that the first priority isn't going to the so-called Western world, but that is the reality, and that's you know, I've been teaching here for, it's been 11-12 years now. I mean, no one has come and said to me that I want to go to China to study. Sorry,
Hassan, just to, not to interrupt, but just to clarify, Your students are all humanities and social sciences?
Yep, absolutely. Okay. But even the students in science and engineering, their first choice would be either North America or Europe, and that's where they would aim to go. So, the question then that needs to be asked is, well, who is going to China then? And it's a good question. I have some ideas about that, but once again, I'm on shaky empirical ground over there. So I'm sort of going to not say it outright, but there's a particular. Let me just say it. I mean, there's a particular demographic that goes to China for education. And that demographic is different from the one that goes to North America. On the question of development, yeah, I mean, I think it's a question of, and sort of the other part of that question was China investing in Pakistan's educational infrastructure. It is and it isn't. It is in the sense that, yeah, I mean, in scores of Pakistani universities, pretty much, I'd say most Pakistani universities, you now have a China center. China center usually means that there's a plaque outside the door, which says China center, and then there will be a lock on the door, but someone somewhere has something on a line on their CV saying that they have the China center. No expertise, no firsthand knowledge of China, no language training, but hey, we have our China centers. Yes, Chinese academics were visiting local universities pre-COVID, but these were highly curated visits. And the sort of conversation that we're having right now, we'd have these type of conversations 20 years ago in China. Yeah, I mean, it's not something that one can imagine doing these days. So sure, I mean, there's a lot of lip service that's being paid to China investing in Pakistan's educational infrastructure. And I don't doubt the sincerity of it for 1 minute, but the reality on the ground is very, very different. Finally, sort of development. Well, I mean, I think that, here again, I think development and if development is going to be meaningful, it needs to be consultative. And it's very hard to have discussions about consultative forms of development when quite frequently you have anti-terrorism legislature that's being used against people who are protesting against the loss of camels. It's very hard to have those conversations when the large majority of the people in this country have never had an opportunity to engage with a person from China. So, I mean, I don't have those opportunities. I mean, this is what I do. But I mean, if you were to ask me right now, who am I? There's thousands of Chinese people living in the city that I'm living in, but sort of living in completely separate bubbles. So, until one can have frank discussions, until one can have an exchange of ideas, until we reach a point where we can start sort of saying and hearing things that we don't necessarily want to say and hear, and accept those and then sort of build on them and move on. It's really hard to see development as something other than being imposed from above.
There you go. That seems, I mean, it's a slightly depressing note to end on, but we can spin that around into a moment of hope. Maybe we can think about ways in which conversations like this across borders do begin to generate something a little bit more meaningful. And of course, there is value. It's just even for the architects of these kinds of projects, even for for those who want these projects to succeed, to think about avoiding resistance on the ground, even from that practical level, right? You want to avoid resistance on the ground because that can be a hassle for you. Maybe consulting would help on the front end. But that's a conversation I think we're gonna have to leave to the side, because I think is it like 11:30 p.m. something like that? Okay,
Yeah.
which is, it's quite late to be keeping you up. One thing I do want to flag, and so we'll have to have another conversation at some point, is that you continue to work in really interesting ways on Central Asia, and so the natural question is the question of comparison. But I think we're gonna have to leave that for later. To what extent, so you come to Toronto, or I'll come there, or we'll meet somewhere else at an academic conference, and I'd love to know how Pakistan's experience, how we might situate that vis-a-vis comparators in Central Asia or elsewhere, in sort of China's broad and I guess broadening neighborhood, right? Sorry to those whose questions I didn't get to. They're just too many great questions, and such interesting opportunities to hear from Dr. Carr. Thank you, Hassan. Thanks for staying up so late. Thanks for
it's my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.
And it's just absolutely great to learn from you. So we'll be in touch. Thanks everyone who joined us today. All right, sleep well.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All the best. Bye bye.
Bye everyone.